In 1998, the life of the Harper family in Charleston, South Carolina, seemed perfect. Daniel Harper was a renowned pastor, respected not only by his congregation but also by the entire neighborhood. His wife, Elizabeth, was the embodiment of virtue, a caring mother, an excellent homemaker, and a pillar of support for her husband. Together, they raised 3 children, Sophie, Rebecca, and James. The family appeared ideal, living a seemingly scripted life, untouched by the gossip that sometimes swept through the small town. But in reality, things were far from simple. Daniel had always taken pride in his marriage. He believed that his union with Elizabeth was bonded not only by love, but also by the sacred vows they had sworn never to break on their wedding day. Their life together had lasted 25 years, during which they had been through much: the birth of their children, financial difficulties, a move to Charleston, and the creation of the life they had always dreamed of. Their home stood in a quiet, leafy neighborhood where children played on the streets, and adults exchanged recipes and gossip over white picket fences. However, in recent years, Daniel had started noticing changes. At first, it was small things. Elizabeth began leaving the house more often, explaining that she needed to meet friends or take care of errands. She started spending less time with the family, and their evenings, once filled with board games and discussions about the future, were now dominated by silence. Where once she would sit beside him, reading a book or chatting about the day, she now increasingly found excuses to avoid conversation. It was like a subtle shadow slowly creeping into their marriage. Elizabeth remained impeccable in her appearance. She always wore neatly pressed dresses, her light blonde hair styled into a perfect bun, and her manners were as soft and elegant as ever. But Daniel couldn't ignore the coldness hidden behind this external perfection. Her smile, which once warmed him, now seemed forced. Her eyes, which once glowed with love, now gazed at him distantly, as if she were lost in her own world. He tried to attribute this to fatigue. Elizabeth had always worked hard at home, and their children also demanded her attention. Sophie, their eldest daughter, had recently started working at a law firm, and Elizabeth often helped her with household matters. Rebecca was studying at university, and her rare visits home were a celebration for the entire family. James, the youngest, was preparing for college and spent most of his time buried in textbooks. The children were living their own lives, and Daniel understood that the family was going through natural changes as the kids grew up and became more independent. But this didn't explain Elizabeth's behavior. One of the most troubling signs was her phone calls. Elizabeth had never hidden her conversations before. She would talk on the phone right in the kitchen while cooking dinner or in the living room, sitting next to him. But now, she often left the room to answer calls, closing the door behind her. Sometimes her voice became too quiet, and Daniel found himself straining to catch a word. Every time she explained it away, saying she was talking to a friend or relative, but his inner voice whispered, "Do you believe her?" The situation worsened when Daniel stumbled upon a box of her old belongings in the garage. It was during a Saturday when he decided to do some spring cleaning. Among the tools, dusty boxes of children's toys, and unnecessary papers, he found a wooden chest. Its lock was broken, and it opened easily. Inside were letters and notes written in Elizabeth's handwriting. They were neatly folded, but one sheet stood out. It had dates and times with brief notes. Meet at 2 p.m. Same address. Need to discuss. These words made no sense, but they etched themselves into his memory. Daniel placed the note back, trying not to jump to conclusions. But from that moment, something changed. He could no longer ignore his unease. Every time Elizabeth left the house, he recalled those dates and wondered, what is she hiding? Nights became particularly difficult. Lying in bed next to Elizabeth, he felt her coldness. She no longer leaned into him as she used to, and sometimes he even noticed her turning away, letting out a faint sigh. In the darkness, his thoughts became unbearable. He recalled conversations with congregants who shared their stories of betrayal. He remembered sermons where he preached about forgiveness and humility. But how could he forgive something he wasn't even sure of? One day, he confided his thoughts to a friend, a fellow pastor, over morning coffee. The friend told him about a man who discovered his wife's infidelity through a genetic test on their children. At first, this story seemed absurd to Daniel, but then he began to wonder. His children, whom he loved more than life itself, indeed resembled Elizabeth, but did he see his reflection in their faces? This question began to gnaw at him. Eventually, Daniel couldn't take it anymore. He decided to conduct a DNA test to dispel his doubts once and for all. He found a way to collect samples from the children, explaining that it was necessary to check for predispositions to certain illnesses. No one suspected anything strange. After all, he was a pastor, a caring father, and his words carried weight. In 1998, Charleston, South Carolina, experienced an unusually hot year. The sun scorched even in September, and morning services at the local church often took place in stifling silence. Standing before his congregation, Daniel Harper spoke about family values, the importance of trust and love. But his thoughts wandered far from his sermon. His soul was consumed by doubts he tried to suppress, but like weeds, they kept resurfacing. After the discovery in the garage, his anxiety only grew. He tried to convince himself he was overreacting, that the dates and strange notes might have a simple explanation. But every word written on that piece of paper replayed in his mind again and again. The questions multiplied. What if he himself was to blame for this rift? Perhaps Elizabeth was simply tired of their monotonous life. Or maybe it was just the toll of long years of marriage, where feelings lose their sharpness. But one thought troubled him most. It struck him unexpectedly as he looked at old family photographs carefully preserved in an album. Flipping through the pages, he studied the faces of his children. Sophie, the eldest, with her straight nose and deep brown eyes, bore a striking resemblance to Elizabeth. Rebecca had inherited her oval face and gentle smile. James, the youngest, with his dark hair and slightly upturned chin, looked more like her than anyone else in the Harper family. And then it hit him. Among all these features, he couldn't find a single one that resembled his own. This thought tormented him. He stared at those photos for a long time, searching for proof of his connection to the children, but his gaze kept returning to the same conclusion. They didn't resemble him. His heart ached with pain. He knew such thoughts were blasphemous. He was their father. He had raised them, loved them, cared for them. Wasn't that enough? But the doubts grew. He tried to talk to Elizabeth to understand what was happening. Her answers were always restrained. She looked at him with mild irritation whenever he asked too many questions. "Why are you acting this way, Daniel?" she asked one day. The question sounded like an accusation, and he fell silent, sensing that every conversation only worsened the situation. One morning at breakfast, he overheard Sophie telling Rebecca about how a coworker in their office recently discovered that her father wasn't her biological parent. "They did some sort of test," Sophie said casually, but those words struck Daniel like lightning. He remembered the conversation with his friend, the pastor, who had told him a similar story. This idea began to consume him completely. Daniel realized that the only way to rid himself of these doubts was to verify everything. He started researching DNA tests, carefully hiding his intentions from his family. Eventually, he found a clinic that offered such tests confidentially. His plan was simple: collect DNA samples from the children and send them to the lab. He thought long and hard about how to do this without raising suspicion. Sophie, Rebecca, and James were old enough to ask questions, but he found an excuse. One evening, at a family dinner, he announced that he wanted to conduct tests to check for potential hereditary diseases. He explained it as a concern for their health, saying it could help prevent problems in the future. The children agreed without much thought. To them, it seemed like another act of care from a father who always worried about his family. Daniel collected the necessary samples, cheek swabs, and carefully packed them, trying not to reveal his trembling hands. He stared at the envelope addressed to the lab for a long time before finally sending it. The days following the test's submission became a true ordeal for him. Every morning he checked the mailbox waiting for the results. His fears and anxieties intensified with each passing day. He noticed that he had become irritable, sometimes short-tempered. Even the children began to notice his odd behavior. One night, unable to sleep, he sat down with the family album again. He flipped through the pages, pausing on each photograph, recalling moments from their lives. There was Sophie on a school stage, her face glowing with joy after a play. Rebecca with a diploma in her hands in front of the university. James with his first basketball medal. They were his life, his pride, his purpose. But now, these memories were clouded by doubts that had become unbearable. He prayed for the test results to bring him liberation. He asked God to forgive him for these doubts, for this weakness that had taken hold of him. But every time he closed his eyes, he saw the piece of paper with those strange dates and phrases he found in the garage. These memories seemed to whisper to him, "You need to know the truth." When the long-awaited day arrived, and he found a sealed envelope with the results in the mailbox, his hands trembled. He went into his study, closed the door, and sat at the desk. Before opening the envelope, he sat in silence, praying and asking God for strength. Inside him, two opposing emotions waged war, hope and fear. Finally, he tore open the envelope and began to read. His eyes scanned the lines until he reached the conclusion. At that moment, time seemed to stop. He stared at the numbers and phrases that, despite their complexity, conveyed one undeniable truth. He was not the biological father of any of his children. At that moment, everything he knew about his life collapsed. His breathing became heavy, his palms sweaty. He couldn't believe what he had just read. This wasn't a mistake. It was a fact. He carefully folded the papers and hid them in his desk drawer. He knew he couldn't tell anyone about this. Not yet. He needed time to sort out his feelings, his actions, and what would come next. He didn't know what awaited him, but one thing was clear. His life would never be the same. The year 1998 was drawing to its climax. In Charleston, South Carolina, the weather was cooling, but a storm raged within Daniel Harper's soul. The discovery he had made through DNA tests had turned his world upside down. He could no longer look at his family the same way. Every glance at his children brought conflicting emotions. Love, pride, but now also a sharp, consuming anger. These children were not his by blood, but they remained his in every other way. However, the truth that he was not their biological father haunted him. For weeks, Daniel lived as if in a fog. He continued his duties as a pastor, delivering sermons and visiting parishioners, but his thoughts always returned to one question. Who was the real father of his children? He couldn't bring himself to confront Elizabeth. Every time he wanted to broach the subject, he was stopped by an internal pain and fear. He wasn't ready for her answer, but Daniel couldn't remain in the dark. One evening, alone in his study, he pulled out the test results once more. He read them over and over, hoping that some error might be hidden in the scientific jargon. But the conclusion was clear. The thought that this was no accident gnawed at him. Elizabeth must have known. She had kept this secret from him for 25 years of their marriage. But what else was she hiding? He began his own investigation. As a man accustomed to analysis and uncovering the truth, Daniel decided to apply those skills to his own life. His work as a pastor often required patience and the ability to get to the heart of people's problems. He was determined to use those abilities to find answers. His first step was to search for anything that might shed light on Elizabeth's past. He returned to the garage where he had once found the box with her notes and began methodically sorting through every container. After hours of searching, he found an old box filled with documents, photographs, and letters. Most of them seemed insignificant: school diplomas, utility bills, postcards from friends. But at the bottom of the box, he discovered an envelope with his father's name, Thomas Harper, written on it. His heart stopped. Inside the envelope were several letters. Daniel slowly pulled out the first letter and began to read. The handwriting was familiar. It was Elizabeth's. She wrote warm, affectionate words to Thomas that were entirely inappropriate for a daughter-in-law addressing her father-in-law. She called him dear, beloved, and mentioned meetings that, in her words, brought her unforgettable happiness. Daniel felt his breathing quicken. He read one letter after another, and each was evidence of a relationship between his wife and his father that he had never suspected. These letters told a story Daniel had never imagined. Judging by the dates, their affair had begun even before his wedding to Elizabeth. Thomas had always been a charismatic man, commanding respect with his strong personality. He had helped Daniel with his pastoral career, offering support and advice. But behind this facade of a caring father lay a betrayal Daniel could never have fathomed. The letters left no doubt. Thomas and Elizabeth had been meeting in secret for years. Their affair had continued even after she married Daniel. They had hidden their relationship, but their bond had been too deep to go unnoticed, especially now, as Daniel pieced together the clues. He began recalling moments from the past. It now seemed strange to him that Thomas had often visited their home without prior notice. He remembered how his father always found time to help Elizabeth with something, whether it was house repairs or looking after the children. At the time, it seemed like the actions of a loving grandfather, but now Daniel saw something more. He also recalled an incident from many years ago when James was just a baby. Thomas held the child in his arms, and Elizabeth looked at him with an expression Daniel had thought was simply gratitude. But now he saw something different: admiration, tenderness, a hidden attachment. Each new revelation added fuel to the fire. Daniel knew he could no longer live in this house as if nothing had happened. He needed to know everything. He sought an opportunity to speak with his father. Thomas was a man who rarely showed his emotions. He was always reserved and confident. But Daniel decided he could force him to confess. They met on neutral ground, a small cafe where Thomas often spent his mornings. Daniel sat across from him, feeling his anger simmering. But he didn't start the conversation right away. Instead, he observed his father, searching for signs of guilt in his behavior. Thomas appeared calm as usual. His fair skin was slightly tanned from frequent walks in the sun, and his gray hair was neatly combed. He looked like a man who had no regrets. Daniel asked him about the past, keeping his voice steady. He spoke about Elizabeth, about the family, about how they had always been able to rely on Thomas's support. But with each new question, he felt his father avoiding eye contact. Thomas's answers were brief, sometimes evasive. This only deepened Daniel's suspicions. Finally, he couldn't hold back any longer and directly asked the question that burned within him. "Did you have a relationship with Elizabeth?" Thomas raised his gaze, and for a moment, something like fear flickered in his eyes. But he quickly composed himself and, with cold calmness, denied it. That was the moment Daniel knew. His father would never admit the truth. Returning home, Daniel felt broken. He knew the truth, but hadn't received the confirmation he so desperately wanted. The letters were his only proof, but they couldn't give him peace of mind. He realized his world had been shattered, and there was no way to rebuild it. That night, he once again lay awake for hours. In the darkness, he tried to figure out how to live with this knowledge. His faith, his family, his life, all of it had been built on a lie. But this was only the beginning of his journey toward ultimate revelation. December 1998 was cold for Charleston, South Carolina. The Atlantic wind swept through the city, adding chill to the air already heavy with Christmas anticipation. Houses lit up with string lights, neighbors decorated their yards with glowing reindeer, and stores bustled with people picking out gifts. But in Daniel Harper's soul, there was neither warmth nor joy. There was only emptiness, filled with an all-consuming rage. After his meeting with his father, Thomas Harper, Daniel realized he could no longer live his life as before. His home, which once seemed like the fortress of his family, now felt like a monument to lies. Every corner reminded him of betrayal. The kitchen table where Thomas often sat helping Elizabeth with dinners, the sofa in the living room where the children played while he thought he was watching over his family. Now, these memories had taken on a distorted hue, as if viewed through a shattered mirror. He spent his days trying to distract himself with work, but it was impossible. Daniel had become withdrawn, somber, and even his parishioners began noticing the change. He avoided questions, preferred to spend time in his study with the door closed, and more frequently looked at Elizabeth's letters hidden away in a secret drawer. Every word on those pages stoked his fury. Thomas, his father, the man he trusted more than anyone, had betrayed him. Elizabeth, the woman he loved, had lied to him their entire life together, hiding an affair that spanned decades, and, most painfully, the children he believed were his own were the product of that infidelity. He began to think about revenge. At first, these were fleeting thoughts he tried to push aside, but with each passing day, they became more vivid. He understood that he couldn't move forward without putting an end to the deception. Daniel was a man of faith, but now he felt that even God had turned his back on him. His prayers felt hollow, and he no longer saw himself as the pastor who could lead others to the truth. All that remained was destruction. One night, as the house lay silent, he sat in the darkness of his study, planning his next steps. His plan began to take shape. He knew he couldn't unleash his fury in front of the children. They weren't to blame for what had happened. They were still his children, despite everything. He needed to send them away. He remembered the suggestion to send James to a winter camp and thought he could convince Sophie and Rebecca to visit friends. That would give him the time he needed. The next day, he began putting his plan into action. The children were easier to persuade than he had expected. James eagerly embraced the idea of camp, especially when Daniel insisted it would be a valuable experience before college. Rebecca, busy with her university life, had no objections to spending a few days with a friend. Sophie also seemed agreeable to a weekend trip to a nearby town to relax after a stressful work week. Everything was falling into place as he had envisioned. Once the children left, the house felt empty. Daniel felt the silence settle over him. At that moment, he knew the time had come. He called his father and invited him to a family dinner. His voice was calm, but inside, he was boiling. Thomas agreed without a hint of suspicion. He even joked that it would be a great opportunity to spend time with the family. Daniel added that Elizabeth was also looking forward to seeing him, which seemed to put Thomas even more at ease. When Elizabeth learned about the dinner plans, she showed no signs of suspicion either. She seemed calm, even cheerful, at the thought of the family gathering. Daniel observed her behavior, noticing how her face lit up at the mention of Thomas. This only strengthened his resolve. The day of the dinner arrived. Daniel rose early and spent hours in the kitchen preparing the meal. He aimed for perfection: roast meat, mashed potatoes, buttered green beans, and homemade apple pie. He wanted everything to look like a typical family dinner so no one would suspect anything. When the guests arrived, everything went according to plan. Thomas was his usual confident self, dressed in a suit and wearing a slight smile. Elizabeth looked elegant as always, her hair neatly styled and her dress accentuating her figure. Neither of them suspected that this dinner would be their last. The conversation at the table flowed smoothly. They talked about family matters, upcoming holidays, and memories from past years. Daniel appeared calm, even smiling, but inside, a storm raged. His hands clenched into fists under the table, and every glance at Thomas or Elizabeth fanned the flames of his anger. As dinner came to an end, Daniel offered to serve dessert. He rose from the table and headed to the kitchen. There, instead of the pie, he retrieved a large kitchen knife from the drawer. His heart pounded like a drum, but his hands remained steady. He knew there was no turning back. Returning to the dining room, he approached his father. Thomas looked up, confused by Daniel's expression. At that moment, Daniel struck the first blow. The blade plunged into Thomas's chest, and he cried out in pain. Elizabeth screamed, leaping up from her chair in panic, but Daniel no longer heard her. Again and again, he stabbed his father until Thomas collapsed to the floor, bleeding out. Elizabeth tried to run, but Daniel caught her in the hallway. Her face was twisted in terror, and she begged him to stop, but he was beyond hearing her pleas. His rage and pain had consumed him. He delivered the first blow, then continued until his fury ebbed along with her screams. When it was over, Daniel stood in silence, surrounded by blood. He looked down at the bodies of the people he once considered his family and realized there was no way back. He walked to the phone, dialed the police, and calmly reported that he had committed a double homicide. The night of the murders left a permanent mark on the Harper home, one that could never be erased. The metallic scent of blood lingered in the air, and the silence was broken only by the distant wail of sirens drawing closer. Daniel Harper sat at the kitchen table, motionless, like a statue. In front of him was the phone he had just placed down after calling the police. His hands, still stained with blood, trembled slightly, but his face remained calm. He knew what he had done, and was ready to face the consequences. The moments after the call felt like hours. His mind was oddly blank. All the thoughts that had tormented him for weeks were gone, leaving behind a single, heavy feeling, overwhelming exhaustion. He felt neither regret nor fear. It was a strange state of being, as though his soul had been emptied, and the anger that had consumed him for so long had finally dissipated. He knew retribution was inevitable, but it no longer seemed to matter. When the police arrived, the flashing lights illuminated the street, prompting neighbors to peek out of their windows. Charleston, despite its size, was a city where news traveled fast. People had long seen the Harper home as a symbol of stability and order, and now that image was shattered. The officers entered the house, their footsteps echoing through the silence. One of them called out to Daniel, but he didn't even lift his head. He simply raised his hands in surrender without saying a word. As he was led outside, neighbors gathered in the shadows, whispering and exchanging glances. Many of them were members of his congregation, their faces filled with disbelief and shock. The police placed him in the back of a patrol car and drove him to the station, leaving behind a team of forensic investigators to examine the scene. Daniel didn't resist or utter a word. His calm demeanor unsettled even the officers, who were accustomed to seeing panic or tears in such situations. He simply sat in silence, his gaze lowered. At the station, the interrogation began. The officers seated across from Daniel asked him the standard questions. They wanted to understand his motives, the details of what had transpired that evening. Daniel, maintaining his composure, recounted everything without any attempt to justify himself. His voice was steady, his tone devoid of emotion. He admitted to killing his father and wife, describing in detail how he prepared the dinner, made his decision, and what had driven him to act. The investigators listened to his account, trying to piece together how a seemingly upstanding pastor could commit such an act of violence. Daniel spoke of the letters, the DNA test, and the betrayal that had spanned years. He spoke calmly, but there was a deep pain in his words. Each time he mentioned his father's or Elizabeth's name, his voice wavered ever so slightly. It wasn't an excuse, it was more like a confession. The police quickly verified everything Daniel had said. The letters found in the house corroborated his story. DNA testing confirmed that none of Daniel's children were biologically his. It all fit into a coherent narrative, a tragedy hidden behind a facade of harmony. Meanwhile, news of the double murder spread throughout Charleston. By morning, local newspapers were already reporting the shocking crime that had rocked the city. Headlines blared, "Pastor kills wife and father in fit of rage. Family drama ends in bloodshed." Parishioners who had listened to Daniel's sermons for years were left reeling. For many, he had been a model of virtue, only to now be revealed as the perpetrator of a horrific crime. Daniel's children, Sophie, Rebecca, and James, learned about the events from the police. They were brought back to the house where they were confronted with the grim reality. Questions far outnumbered answers. For them, it was an unimaginable blow. Their mother and grandfather had been killed by the man they had considered their protector and pillar of strength. But the hardest truth was learning about their true parentage. The police showed them the DNA results and explained that Daniel was not their biological father. The children were devastated. They struggled to comprehend how it had all come to this, but there was no one to offer them solace. Their world had collapsed in an instant. Sophie, as the eldest, tried to support her siblings but was on the verge of breaking herself. Rebecca withdrew into herself, while James, the youngest, was overcome with anger and despair. For them, it wasn't just the loss of their family, it was the loss of their identity. The trial began a few weeks later. Daniel fully admitted his guilt. His lawyers attempted to use his psychological state as a mitigating factor, but the prosecution focused on the brutality of the crime. The prosecutor described in detail how Daniel had planned the murders, how he had inflicted dozens of stab wounds, and how he had calmly called the police afterward. Daniel sat in the courtroom without showing any emotion. He didn't look at his children, who attended the hearings, nor did he try to justify himself to them. He had accepted his fate. When the judge handed down the sentence, life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, he simply nodded. He didn't care anymore. He no longer felt alive. On the day he was taken to prison, Daniel glanced out the window of the bus as it passed by his home. He saw only the shadows of his past: warm evenings, the laughter of children, Elizabeth's smile. All of it was now in the past, a memory of a life that no longer existed. Prison became Daniel Harper's new reality. After his sentencing, he was transferred to one of South Carolina's most secure facilities, McCormick Correctional Institution. This harsh, cold environment was the complete opposite of everything he had known. Narrow concrete walls devoid of any comfort, barred windows that let in only thin strips of light, and the constant echo of guards' footsteps. This was his new daily existence. Daniel was placed in solitary confinement. Perhaps this decision was tied to his past. The prison administration likely believed that a former pastor who had killed his wife and father wouldn't adapt well to the general population. Or perhaps it was for his own protection, as many of the inmates, aware of his crime, harbored disdain for him. For Daniel, however, the solitude was a form of salvation. It allowed him to think, to reflect, and to live in his own world, away from the judgmental eyes of others. From his first days in prison, Daniel was absorbed by the monotonous rhythm of life behind bars. Wake up at 6 a.m, roll call, breakfast, brief walks in the yard, work in the workshop. The day was structured down to the minute. Yet even within this rigid routine, Daniel found time for prayer. He read the Bible, which became his only source of comfort. Sometimes he reread familiar passages dozens of times, searching for answers to his most pressing question: why had everything unfolded this way? His faith, once the guiding light of his life, now felt like a heavy burden. He felt he had betrayed his principles, his beliefs, his mission. He knew what he had done was wrong, yet he couldn't forgive himself or those who had shattered his life. Every prayer he recited felt empty, as though he were speaking to a God who no longer listened. Outside the prison walls, his name continued to evoke shock and condemnation. Newspapers sensationalized the details of his case, emphasizing his role as a pastor. The public eagerly discussed how someone who preached love and forgiveness could commit such a horrific act. His story became a cautionary tale, a grim reminder of how even the most virtuous people could fall when pushed too far. But Daniel's greatest heartbreak was his children's reaction. Sophie, Rebecca, and James refused to visit him in prison. They sent only one letter, written by Sophie, which stated that they could never forgive him for what he had done. They felt doubly betrayed. first by the lies their mother and grandfather had hidden, and then by their father's decision to destroy their lives so brutally. To them, he was no longer a protector or a parent. Daniel reread the letter dozens of times. Each word pierced his heart like a knife. He knew his children were right, yet he couldn't shake the feeling that he, too, was a victim. He remembered their faces, their laughter, their childhood years playing in the yard. These memories were the only bright spots in his mind. He clung to the hope that one day they might understand him, if not forgive him. As the years passed, Daniel's life in prison settled into routine. He rarely interacted with other inmates, preferring to spend his time in solitude. His cell contained nothing but a narrow bed, a desk, and a shelf holding his Bible, and a few letters from former parishioners who wrote words of support. These letters reminded him that even in his downfall, some still believed in his sincerity. One of the few times he left his cell was for conversations with the prison chaplain, an elderly man named John Matthews who had served in the prison for decades. John understood that Daniel was in a deep crisis of faith and tried to help him find solace. They had long discussions about forgiveness, about the importance of accepting guilt, and about the need to move forward despite the weight of one's actions. During one such conversation, John asked, "Can you forgive yourself, Daniel?" The question struck him to his core. He knew he couldn't answer it. His guilt was too overwhelming, his actions too monstrous. He was trapped in a cycle of regret and self-loathing, with no escape. Years went by. Daniel Harper was forgotten. His name no longer appeared in newspapers, and his family avoided mentioning him in conversations. The house where the tragedy occurred was sold to strangers. Those who knew the story avoided the place, as if afraid the walls still held echoes of that terrible night. Daniel continued his days in his cell, starting each morning with a prayer and ending it in silence. He didn't know how much time he had left, but deep down, he understood it no longer mattered. His life had ended the night he picked up the knife. All that remained was the wait for the end. 8 years had passed since Daniel Harper was imprisoned. It was now 2006, but for him, time seemed to have stopped. Each day was a mirror of the last. The same gray walls, the same monotonous routine, and the same unrelenting thoughts that never left his mind. McCormick Correctional Institution had long become a kind of personal purgatory, a place where he lived out his sins but found neither redemption nor forgiveness. Over the years, Daniel had faded into near invisibility. The newspapers, once filled with sensational details of his case, had long since moved on to other scandals and crimes. For society, he had become a relic of a forgotten story, a symbol of scandal recalled only in passing conversations. His name no longer shocked or angered people. It had vanished from public memory, like any sensation displaced by the next headline. Daniel lived in the shadows. The only people who occasionally remembered him were the prison guards and the chaplain, John Matthews. John continued to visit Daniel, despite his withdrawn and silent demeanor. He tried to help Daniel find inner peace, speaking of forgiveness and reminding him that every person deserved redemption. But those words no longer resonated with Daniel. He listened, but didn't believe. All he felt was emptiness. Daniel's children never visited him. They didn't write, nor did they try to contact him. To them, he no longer existed. Sophie and Rebecca had moved to other states, striving to leave their past behind. Sophie, ever determined, built a successful career in law. Rebecca, despite her trauma, found solace in her work as a teacher. James, the youngest, struggled the most. His youth had been shattered by that fateful night, and it took him years to rebuild his life. Even with their successes, none of them wanted to revisit the memories of a family that once seemed perfect. The Harper home in Charleston remained a somber reminder of the tragedy. After the murders, it had been sold, and the new owners tried to erase its past. They repainted the walls, replaced the old furniture, and removed anything that could recall its previous inhabitants. Yet the locals still avoided the house. Neighbors couldn't forget the sight of police carrying out bodies, and that memory was too vivid to simply fade away. In prison, Daniel sought solace in prayer, but his faith was deeply fractured. He no longer felt the presence of the God who had once been his guiding star. Sometimes he wondered if his own sins had led him to this end. Had he been a poor husband, father, pastor? These thoughts became unbearable, yet no answers came. One day, Chaplain John brought Daniel a letter. It wasn't from his children, nor from anyone he knew. It was from a former parishioner, who wrote about how Daniel's sermons had once helped him through difficult times. "You taught us about forgiveness, and I want you to know, I forgive you," the letter read. Daniel stared at those words for a long time, but he felt no relief. He couldn't forgive himself. His health began to deteriorate. Age, stress, and life in prison had taken their toll. He grew increasingly ill, and doctors delivered progressively grim diagnoses. Yet Daniel didn't seek help. He saw it as part of his punishment. When he was diagnosed with terminal heart failure, he merely nodded, showing neither fear nor surprise. The final months of his life were spent in the prison infirmary. He spoke little, but Chaplain John occasionally noticed his lips moving in silent prayer. No one knew what he prayed for forgiveness, for peace, or for death to come quickly. His death came quietly one night. A guard checking his room found him lying on his bed with a Bible in his hands. There was no fear on his face, only a calmness he may have sought for years. Daniel Harper's death went almost unnoticed. The prison notified his children, but they did not respond. His body was cremated, and his ashes were buried in an unmarked grave at the prison cemetery. No one came to mourn him. His story, once a scandal that rocked Charleston, faded from memory, leaving only whispers and rumors. The house where the tragedy occurred still stood in Charleston years later. The new owners had tried to sell it, but buyers were scarce. For those who knew its history, it remained a symbol of a broken family and the darkness that could hide behind a seemingly perfect facade. Life went on, but Daniel Harper's name became just a shadow of the past, a reminder of how lies and betrayal could bring even the strongest family to ruin. His story ended in silence, but the lessons it carried lingered, etched into the hearts of those who remembered.